James Aldred was 52 years old, and the spare bedroom smelled of old wood and the dry warmth of apartment heat, and the faint machine oil smell that the clock carried from wherever his father had kept it for 30 years. A smell that had no business being in a Columbus apartment spare bedroom, and was there anyway, specific and persistent. The smell of a place James knew better than his own kitchen. The clock was on the dresser. He had set it there when he brought it home and had not moved it since, because moving it would require deciding where it belonged, and deciding where it belonged felt like accepting what it was, which was the only thing his father had left him in a proceeding that had distributed the rest with professional efficiency. The dresser surface was cold under his palm when he reached out and touched the mahogany base. The clock was brass and mahogany, approximately 18 inches tall, the face the pale cream of old clock faces. The hand stopped at 11:43. The mechanism made no sound. It had not made any sound since the last time William had wound it, which was at some point before the last hospitalization, which made the stop time feel more specific than it was. Along the right side of the base, a hairline crack, fine as a pencil line, running from the top edge of the panel to the bottom. His checking account held $4,847. In 3 weeks, a lease renewal would arrive that would raise his rent by $213 a month, which he had been doing the arithmetic on since the notice came. James had spent 12 years as the operational director of Aldred Manufacturing. Not the title, because the title had not fully reflected the work, but the work. Plant schedules, supplier contracts, the logistics of running 7 facilities across 4 states, the specific institutional knowledge of a manufacturing company that a company needs to function, and that is invisible when it is working correctly. His younger brother Garrett had been the public half. The press interviews, the industry conference appearances, the relationship with their father conducted in rooms James was rarely in. William Aldred had died 4 months ago at 81, having built a manufacturing empire from a single machine shop in Findlay into a billion-dollar industrial supply company. He had died without updating a will he had signed 16 years ago. Garrett had been named executor in that will. Named before James was doing any of the work that had made the company what it became, named at a time when Garrett was the public face and the relationship and the presence in the rooms William inhabited. The estate had been distributed accordingly. The Worthington compound, the controlling shares, the investment accounts, distributed according to a document that had been signed in a different era of the family's life, and that no one had thought to update, or perhaps had thought to update and decided not to. The clock had been on the mantel of William's private study at the Findlay plant, the room where William did his actual thinking, where the desk was positioned to face the window and not the door, where James had been hundreds of times across 12 years, and Garrett perhaps a dozen. The certified mail arrived on a Tuesday. A woman named Patricia Cho, writing from a Columbus law office, on behalf of a private trust she represented. James set the letter down and looked at the clock on the dresser and thought about the hundreds of times he had walked into William's study at the Findlay plant and seen it on the mantel, and thought that his father had never once mentioned why he kept a broken clock. Columbus in March smelled of the Scioto River and the particular industrial residue of a Midwestern city that has been manufacturing things since before anyone thought to call it a legacy. A smell that was cold and specific, and that belonged to the season before spring committed. Patricia Cho's office was on the 14th floor of a building on High Street, glass-walled and ordered. A long conference table, files in labeled sequence along one side, a view of the river in the middle distance through windows that handled the March light without softening it. Patricia was precise and unhurried, the manner of a practice that handles significant matters without requiring anyone to announce that they are significant. The estate proceeding had taken place 6 weeks ago. The same building, a different floor, a conference room James had entered, knowing what was in the will and leaving having confirmed it. Garrett had sat at the head of the table in a blazer, the color of expensive charcoal, the fit of something made for a specific person's specific dimensions, the kind of fit that announces that the person wearing it considers presence a professional competency. He wore a watch that James recognized as a Patek Philippe because William had shown James the same model in a catalog when James was 34 and had explained the movement in the specific way William explained things he valued, with technical precision rather than sentiment. Garrett's cologne was warm and deliberate, selected to read as restrained wealth, the kind of thing that costs more than it announces. He had managed the estate proceeding with the practiced ease of a man who prepares for public events by understanding that the preparation should be invisible. Everything in order. Everything explained. The attorney moving through the distribution in the sequence Garrett had approved, the Worthington compound, assessed at $2.1 million, to Garrett. Aldred Manufacturing controlling shares, 62%, to Garrett, with the 16-year-old will's specific language intact. The investment accounts, combined value $847,000, divided in proportions the old will specified. Vehicles and personal property, cataloged, assessed, distributed. James received one item, the broken mantel clock from William's study at the Findlay plant. Garrett had noted it in the personal property inventory with the description: decorative clock, non-functional, sentimental value. The assessment of a man who had looked at an object rather than examined it. Garrett had looked across the conference table at James, at the brother who had spent 12 years solving problems. Garrett did not notice while Garrett was in rooms with their father. With the constructed warmth of someone performing grief while managing outcomes, the specific warmth of a man who has already received everything he came for and can now afford to be generous about what remains, he said. Dad always said that clock was just something he kept around. I thought you'd appreciate having something from the study. Just something he kept around. The sentence was built to sound like explanation. It was built like everything Garrett built, efficiently, for the effect it would produce, without requiring the substance beneath the surface. James said nothing. He looked at the inventory description. He looked at the word sentimental. He looked at the Patek Philippe, catching the conference room light on Garrett's wrist, and thought about William showing him the same model in a catalog and explaining the movement, and thought about the kind of man who values a thing for what it actually is, and the kind who values it for what it signals. Now, in Patricia Cho's office, she slid the envelope across the conference table. William's handwriting on the front, the deliberate, angular print of a machinist who had learned to write the way he did everything, with precision and no excess. James's name, spelled correctly, the letters formed with the care of a man who knew this letter would be read eventually and had decided it would be legible when it was. Inside, a single folded page. The first 3 lines were about the trust. At the bottom of the page, one instruction: open the base of the clock. Carefully, he drove back to his apartment in the Ohio March cold and set the clock on the kitchen table and stood in front of it for a moment. And then he went to the kitchen drawer and found a screwdriver. Because he had spent 12 years solving problems, his brother did not notice, and he was not going to stop now. The hairline crack in the right side of the mahogany base panel was something James had noticed when he first looked at the clock. The kind of fine surface fracture that old wood develops, that suggests age rather than damage, that reads as the natural conclusion of years. He had not thought about it further. He pressed the tip of the screwdriver into the crack at its upper end and applied gentle lateral pressure. The panel did not splinter. It moved, fractionally, the resistance of something fitted tightly, rather than the resistance of something that is part of the structure it is in. He worked the tip along the seam from top to bottom. The seam that he could now see was not a crack in the wood, but a joint between the panel and the frame, fitted so tightly that the appearance of a fracture was not accident but intention. The panel came off in one piece, lifting clear of a small lip at the bottom edge, the fit of something made to be removed and replaced many times. Inside, a shallow cavity, the floor of it lined with black felt in the specific, purposeful way of felt that has been cut to fit a dimension rather than trimmed from a larger piece. Resting on the felt, a roll of paper tied with a single piece of thread. The paper slightly yellowed at the edges but intact at the center, the roll the width of his palm and approximately 9 inches long. He set it on the kitchen table and untied the thread. The smell reached him before it was fully unrolled. the chemical flatness of waterproof paper, the specific smell of paper treated against moisture, a smell that is not the smell of paper but the smell of a decision about paper, and beneath it, very faintly, machine oil. The smell that had been the smell of every space his father had ever occupied. The smell of the Findlay plant's concrete floors and metal equipment. Translated into the kitchen of a Columbus apartment through a document that had been sealed in a clock for some period of time James could not determine. He unrolled it fully. A hand-drawn map on waterproof paper. His father's drafting hand, the specific angular precision of William's spatial thinking, the same hand James had read on plant layouts and supply route diagrams for 30 years, unmistakable. The map showed Findlay, Ohio, the original plant site on Blanchard Street, labeled in Williams' notation system. A rectangle labeled Building 3, the original machine shop 1963, operational until 2004, converted to archive storage in 2007. Inside the rectangle, in the northwest corner, an X. Beside the X in his father's hand. Below the northwest corner, iron door, key on reverse. He turned the paper over. Taped to the back with aged tape. The tape so dry and thin as to be nearly invisible against the waterproof surface, pressed flat by whatever had been resting against it in the clock's cavity. A small flat key, iron, the bow the width of a thumbnail, the cut simple and old. The kitchen was cold. His hands were not entirely steady when he held the map, and he noted this the way he noted operational variables, as a fact to account for rather than a problem to be concerned about. He looked at the key. He looked at the notation on the front. He thought about Building 3. He'd been in Building 3 hundreds of times across 12 years of plant operations. The old machine shop with its concrete floor, and the archive shelving that had replaced the equipment in 2007. He knew the northwest corner. He had stood in the northwest corner. He had walked across it carrying binders of supplier documentation and rolling carts of archived files, and had not, in any of those hundreds of crossings, noticed anything below it. He stood at the kitchen table for a full minute, the map in one hand and the key in the other. Then he picked up his keys. He drove to Findlay that afternoon, 81 miles on I-75, the Ohio plains flat and gray in the March light. And when he turned onto Blanchard Street and saw the plant site, he felt the particular weight of arriving at a place you know completely and are about to understand differently. Building 3 smelled of old paper and machine oil, and the particular dry cold of an unheated Ohio industrial building in March, the cold that has been accumulating since October and has no intention of releasing before May. The archive shelving ran in rows from the east wall to within 12 feet of the northwest corner, where it stopped, leaving an open area of concrete floor that James had always taken as an artifact of how the archive had been arranged when the conversion happened in 2007. He had been in this building hundreds of times. He had never thought about why the northwest corner was clear. He crouched in the corner now and ran his palm flat across the concrete. The seam was there. Approximately 4 feet by 3, the concrete within it slightly different in texture than the surrounding floor. Not visibly, not in a way that would register to someone walking across it, but palpably, under a palm pressed flat, the difference between concrete poured in one pour and concrete poured in two. Someone had poured this section separately. Someone had poured it over something they wanted to be able to access again. He pressed the flat bow of the iron key to the near edge of the seam and applied lateral pressure. The panel gave, not much, just the give of something that is resting rather than bonded, the specific slight movement of a cover on a frame. He worked around the edge until he found at the panel's center a recessed iron ring flush with the surface, visible only when you knew to crouch and look for it at the right angle in the available light. He hooked 2 fingers through the ring and applied upward force. The panel rose on a counterweight. The counterweight installed in the frame at some point in the last 50 years. The mechanism engineered to make a 4-foot concrete cover manageable by a single person. The panel swung up and clear and rested against the shelving. Below, an iron staircase, 12 steps, descending into the earth under the original machine shop floor. He went down at the bottom. A steel door set into a poured concrete wall, 1 keyhole. The steel itself painted a dark gray that had not chipped. He put the key in the lock. The tumblers were stiff, decades of minimal use making the mechanism deliberate, and it took 30 seconds of careful, even pressure before he felt the bolts release in sequence, one after another, heavy and final. The door swung inward on hinges that gave no sound, maintained, periodically oiled, the silence of them, the silence of something that has been visited intentionally over many years. The smell that came from the room stopped him at the threshold. Cedar first, warm and dry and specific. The cedar of a sealed space that has been held at a controlled temperature. The smell that cedar achieves only after decades of doing the work it was installed to do. Beneath the cedar, dry paper, the sweetness of paper preserved correctly over a long period, the slight chemical quality of archival documents. And beneath both of those, something metallic and weighted, the smell of engraved financial paper in quantity. Bearer bonds have a specific smell, the smell of currency-grade printing, and the chemical preservatives applied to documents meant to outlast the institutions that issued them. The room was 19 feet by 14. The walls poured concrete, the floor stone, the ceiling the concrete of the building above. Along 3 walls, custom-built wooden shelving, treated and intact, holding flat archival boxes in rows, each box labeled in William's handwriting with a year and a notation system James did not immediately understand. In the center of the room, a wooden table, clean, as though someone had wiped it recently. On the table, a flat wooden case, sealed with a brass clasp. On top of the case, an envelope. James's name. He opened the archival boxes first, because he was the kind of person who understood the situation before he read the interpretation. Pre-WWI European bearer bonds, issued between 1933 and 1939 by 3 European industrial concerns that William's father had invested in as a business partner during the interwar expansion years. The engraved paper dense and formal, the issuing institutions named, the bearer status meaning that whoever held them owned them and had always owned them and had never needed to register that ownership with any authority. Transferred to William in 1951 as part of a private settlement for outstanding partnership interests. A timing entirely consistent with the post-war period in which European nations and corporations settled foreign claims that had been suspended during the war. William had maintained them here, in a room under the original machine shop floor, outside the company's financial records, and outside every estate document that had ever been prepared in the Aldred family's name for 42 years. The flat wooden case held the trust documentation. The Aldred Private Trust, established 1981. James Aldred, sole beneficiary. An appraiser's letter dated 6 months before William died estimated the trust's current value. The bearer bonds at redemption price through their successor institutions. The private investment portfolio managed separately from Aldred Manufacturing across 42 years, combined. $2.3 billion. He opened the envelope last, 2 pages in William's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death. William wrote that the repository was built in 1974 when he understood clearly enough what kind of men his sons were becoming and what kind of planning that understanding required. He wrote that Garrett was good at what Garrett did, that the business needed someone who could be its public face, and Garrett had been exactly that, and the business in Garrett's hands would probably be fine. He wrote that James was the person who kept the business alive for 12 years while Garrett was its face, and that William had always known this, had known it while it was happening, and that knowing it while allowing Garrett to receive the credit was the thing he was not proud of and could not undo. He wrote that the trust belonged to James because James built things and maintained things and understood how things worked and never once demanded acknowledgement for any of it, and that a man who does not demand credit for his work is the only kind of man who can be trusted with assets that have been waiting this long for someone to find them. He told James to contact an attorney named Howard Beck in Cleveland before speaking to Garrett or to anyone connected to the estate, because Howard had been managing the trust for 7 years and knew exactly what to do. He closed. You kept the company running for 12 years and asked for nothing except to be allowed to keep working. That's the only qualification I ever cared about. James read the letter once, standing in the repository with the cedar smell around him, and the archival boxes on the shelves behind him, and the appraiser's number visible on the document in his left hand. He stood completely still. He stood with the letter the way you stand with something that reorganizes 12 years of your understanding of your own professional life in the time it takes to read 2 pages. He was on the second page when he heard, through the concrete above him, the sound of a car on the Blanchard Street lot. He put the letter in his jacket, put the appraiser's document in his jacket, closed the wooden case, and climbed the 12 steps to the floor of Building 3. And when he came through the concrete panel, Garrett's car was in the lot outside the building's east door. Garrett's car was a black Mercedes sedan, clean, recent, the kind of clean that belongs to a vehicle that has not been driven on Ohio winter roads without being washed immediately after. It was conspicuously wrong for the Blanchard Street industrial lot in March, where the surface was a combination of cracked asphalt and the salt residue of 4 months of winter maintenance, where every other vehicle belonged to someone who worked here. He got out with the practiced ease of a man who makes a point of moving through unfamiliar environments without appearing unfamiliar with them. He had a man with him, his estate attorney, Ray Voss, from a Columbus firm, carrying a document case in the specific way of attorneys who carry document cases to locations where the document case is meant to communicate something about the situation before anything is said. Garrett looked at James, at the jacket, at the way James was standing in the cold outside Building 3's east door. At Building 3 itself, the archive storage building, the original machine shop, the building James had come out of. His expression went through a small, controlled recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has assembled a plan and has just encountered a variable the plan did not account for, who is now deciding how to incorporate the variable without acknowledging that it needed incorporating. He said he had been reviewing the estate documentation. He said his attorneys had identified certain assets associated with Williams' private activities at the Findlay plant that may not have been fully captured in the estate inventory, which was the description of a man who had been researching the estate's periphery since the proceeding concluded, who had identified something connected to the plant and had prepared accordingly before he drove here. He said this with the tone of a man performing administrative thoroughness, the tone that makes a claim sound like housekeeping. Ray Voss opened the document case and produced a petition, already filed with the Franklin County Probate Court, already assigned a case number, asserting that any assets associated with the Findlay plant facilities that had not been inventoried in the original estate proceeding might constitute estate assets subject to supplemental administration. The petition had a 24-day response window from the filing date, which was yesterday. Garrett said he was not trying to make this adversarial. He said it with the specific practiced warmth of someone who has spent a career making adversarial things sound collegial, who understands that the warmth is not incompatible with the claim, that the warmth is, in fact, part of the claim structure. He looked at James's jacket. At the interior pocket where the outline of documents was visible, where the appraisal letter and Williams' 2 pages were sitting against James's chest in the cold Ohio March air, he said, "I just want to make sure Dad's intentions are fully honored." James looked at Ray Voss's document case. He looked at Garrett's Mercedes, clean and black, and entirely out of place in this lot, and at Garrett in the custom charcoal fit of a man who considers presence a professional asset, standing in an industrial parking lot in Ohio in March with a supplemental estate petition. And what he believed was 24 days of advantage. He thought about Howard Bake in Cleveland, about the specific detail William had included when he named Howard, that Howard had been managing the trust for 7 years, which meant Howard had begun managing it during William's lifetime, which meant the trust's legal structure had been active and maintained for 7 years before the estate proceeding began, entirely outside anything Garrett had organized or could organize now. James said, "I'll need to speak with my attorney before I respond to this." Garrett nodded, the nod of a man who has heard this response before and has calculated that 24 days is more than enough time for someone in James's position to find and brief an attorney and arrive at the conclusion Garrett has already reached on their behalf. He said, "Of course." He said 24 days. He said it as though it were a courtesy he was extending. Ray Voss closed the document case. They got back in the Mercedes. James watched the car cross the lot and turn onto Blanchard Street and disappear. He stood in the cold for a moment longer, outside Building 3, with $2.3 billion in documentation in his jacket interior pocket and a name in Cleveland he hadn't yet called. He waited until the Mercedes was back on Blanchard Street. Then he sat in his car in the industrial lot and took out his phone and found Howard back in Cleveland and called, and when Howard answered, he said, "William Aldridge's son. I've been to the repository." And Howard said, "I've been expecting this call for 7 years." Howard Bake answered on the second ring and said he had been expecting this call since William Aldridge came to his office in 2018 and told him precisely when the call would come and in what order he was to explain what he was holding. He began with the trust's formation. In 1981, William had established the Aldridge Private Trust as an irrevocable trust, a legal entity separate from Aldridge Manufacturing, separate from William Aldridge's personal holdings, separate from any estate that would be administered in William's name when William died. The trust's assets, the pre-WWI European bearer bonds, and a private investment portfolio that William had built and maintained separately from the company's finances across 42 years, had been contributed to the trust at its formation in 1981. From that moment, they had not been William's personal assets. They had been the trust's assets. The trust named James Aldridge as its sole beneficiary. Howard had been appointed trustee in 2018, 7 years before William's death. He had been managing the trust's investment portfolio since then. The trust had been registered with the Ohio Secretary of State's office in 1981 under its own name, the Aldridge Private Trust, rather than under William Aldridge's personal name, specifically because registration under a trust's own name does not appear in a standard estate search conducted under the grantor's personal name. Garrett's estate attorneys had searched William Aldridge's personal holdings and had found what was registered under William Aldridge's personal name. The Aldridge Private Trust had been an independent legal entity for 43 years. It was not registered under William Aldridge's personal name. It had not been found because the search that would find it was not the search that had been conducted. The supplemental estate petition, Howard said, asserted that uninventoried personal estate assets associated with the Findlay plant facilities were subject to supplemental administration. The Aldridge Private Trust's assets were not personal estate assets. They had not been personal estate assets since 1981. A petition asserting jurisdiction over personal estate assets had no jurisdiction over assets that had left the personal estate 43 years before the petition was written. Additionally, Howard said, the bearer bond redemption process, which he had initiated with the successor entities of the issuing institutions at William's prearranged instruction, triggered by James's call, would complete in approximately 60 days. The investment portfolio was liquid and accessible immediately upon trust confirmation. James could receive distributions within the week if he chose. The meeting Howard arranged took place in a Cleveland conference room 11 days later. Howard's firm, a building on Euclid Avenue, neutral ground outside Franklin County and outside Columbus. James sat beside Howard at one side of the table. Garrett arrived with Ray Voss and a second attorney, whose presence confirmed that the 11 days had been eventful for Garrett's legal team. Patricia Cho attended as a document witness, having driven from Columbus at Howard's invitation, because William had anticipated this meeting and had made sure that the woman who held his sealed instruction would be in the room when the instruction was completed. Howard placed 3 items on the table: the 1981 Aldridge Private Trust registration, filed with the Ohio Secretary of State, the filing stamp dated 43 years prior, the 2018 trustee appointment instrument naming Howard as trustee, 7 years before William died, 7 years before Garrett organized the estate proceeding, and the trust's current asset statement, the bearer bond portfolio at current redemption value through the successor institutions, whose redemption process Howard had already initiated. The investment portfolio at current market value, combined and stated at the top of the statement in the clean numerical language of financial documentation. $2.3 billion. Ray Voss picked up the 1981 registration. He read the formation date. He read the irrevocability clause. the clause that made the trust's separation from William's personal estate not just administrative but permanent, unalterable, and 43 years old. He put it down on the table with the specific, deliberate care of a professional who has understood something and is deciding the least damaging formulation in which to communicate it. Garrett looked at the asset statement. He looked at the number. He looked at the 1981 formation date, the year James was 9 years old, the year William had already decided what kind of men his sons were going to be and what kind of planning that understanding required. He looked across the Cleveland conference room table at James, at the operational brother, the background brother, the brother he had described to a conference room full of attorneys as the appropriate recipient of a broken, non-functional decorative clock of sentimental value, and the performed warmth of the man who had explained that their father just kept the clock around was not performing anything. The performance had run out of material. James looked at him steadily, without heat, without the relief of having wanted to be in this moment, just looking at the man who had organized an estate proceeding and had been thorough in the way of a man who checks what he expects to find. He always said that clock was just something he kept around. Turns out that's not quite what he meant. The silence was witnessed by Howard Bake, who had held the trust for 7 years in exactly the condition William had left it, by Ray Voss, who had put the 1981 registration down and not picked it up again, by the second attorney, who had come to Cleveland prepared for a contested proceeding and had understood within 4 minutes of the meeting's start that there was nothing to contest, and by Patricia Cho, who had driven from Columbus on a Tuesday morning to sit in a Cleveland conference room and be present when a sealed envelope she had carried for 4 years delivered the conclusion it had been carrying toward. James drove back to Columbus on I-71 in the early evening with the Ohio plains going dark on both sides of the highway, and he thought about William building the repository in 1974 and establishing the trust in 1981, and maintaining both for 43 years, and he understood that his father had spent 4 decades becoming the person who could do this quietly enough that no one would notice. Garrett's supplemental petition is withdrawn 17 days after the Cleveland meeting, 7 days before the response deadline, on Ray Voss's advice that proceeding against a 1981 irrevocable trust registration would mean overturning a legal structure that had stood in Ohio trust law for 43 years without a single point of vulnerability. Garrett does not contact James again. The second attorney who attended the Cleveland meeting resigns from the matter 4 days after the hearing. The bearer bond redemption completes 63 days later. The successor institutions process the claims without dispute. Pre-WI bearer bonds from recognized institutions follow an established redemption pathway, and Howard Bake's 7 years of preparation had left the documentation complete down to the last page. Combined redemption and investment portfolio value at distribution: $2.31 billion, paid out to James Aldred as sole trust beneficiary over a structured 60-day period. He leaves his Columbus apartment. He buys a house in Findlay, Ohio, not far from the Blanchard Street plant, in a neighborhood he knows from 30 years of early morning drives to work. He establishes a foundation, the William Aldred Manufacturing Fund, providing equipment and technical training grants to small American machine shops. In its first year, the fund distributes $4.7 million to 31 shops across 11 states. The broken clock is on the mantle now, in the front room of the Findlay house. A clockmaker in town repaired the mechanism. It runs accurately, the brass polished, the mahogany base intact. The seam where the panel was is still visible if you know to look for it. In the mornings, he makes coffee in a kitchen that smells of old Ohio house and the machine oil that is simply the smell of this part of the state. And he drinks it at a window facing the street, and he does not calculate the rent increase. William Aldred did not leave his son a broken clock. He left him the map inside it, and 43 years of faith that he would know what to do with both.